Welcome back to HLM History and the history of ancient Egypt. Where we last left off, the Middle Kingdom saw an Egyptian renaissance in terms of both art and military. But after the great reigns of Senusret III and Amenemhat III, the country was completely exhausted. The last rulers of the 12th dynasty could do little to change the path Egypt was heading towards. The strong, centralized government, like that of the Old Kingdom, was slowly dying. A new age of war and division was fast approaching, and a period known as the Second Intermediate Period was just about to begin. The 13th dynasty, which started around 1800 BC, was given a bad starting hand. Now, it's important to note that we still haven't reached a dark age. The Middle Kingdom might be sick and dying, but it wasn't dead yet. We already start this dynasty with a bit of chronological confusion. The Turin King list says that the 13th dynasty starts with a man named Wagath, but now we assume he actually ruled in the middle of the dynasty. If you couldn't tell, this isn't really a great sign of the health of the Egyptian state, if real names are being confused and mixed up. Instead, we start with Sobek-hotep I. It's possible Sobek-hotep had to deal with a rival dynasty to the north, but this dynasty probably rose up much later. What we do know for sure is that the central government was, like during the First Intermediate Period, extremely weak. The fact that a rival dynasty was allowed to continue up north highlights this internal weakness. Along with this, there are a bunch of pharaohs belonging to these dynasties. For the 13th dynasty, there were over 40 pharaohs in the span of about 150 years, implying that royal power was extremely weak and that assassinations were common. Another theory, contributed by Egyptologist Toby Wilkinson, implies that these pharaohs were all very old by the time they ascended. This would explain the rapid succession and the short reigns. This same trend of many rulers in little time also exists with the 14th dynasty. For reference, the 12th dynasty lasted for about 200 years and only had 8 rulers. To see this trend from strong, long reigns to weak, short ones can allow us to infer the internal state of Egypt at this time. With the governments so weak, the opportunity for foreign invaders to enter Egypt was beginning to rise. Despite their power beginning to crumble, the 13th dynasty still held the capital in the city of Ajatawe, for now anyways, and probably began to fight the 14th dynasty. The forts that symbolized the might of the Middle Kingdom were gradually becoming irrelevant, and were soon forgotten about. The 13th dynasty eventually abandoned the Middle Kingdom conquests, and the Kingdom of Kush began to grow to Egypt's south. They, especially when Egypt was in this weakened state, would become dangerous enemies. Already by the end of the 12th dynasty, Asiatic and Canaanite people were migrating to Egypt. As the power of the state waned, the migrations continued on, especially after the forts became empty. These Canaanite and Asiatic peoples began to somewhat diffuse into Egyptian society. Interestingly, the 14th dynasty, the same dynasty that possibly rose up against Sobek-hotep I, was made up of Canaanite rulers, or at least contained Canaanite names. By the early 17th century BC, the 13th dynasty moved the capital from Ajatawe to Thebes. To many, this is considered the end of the Middle Kingdom. Egypt's second golden age was officially over, and its second dark age, the Second Intermediate Period, had begun. As I have said before, both the 13th and the 14th dynasties were extremely weak. All that was needed was for a new group to rise up and replace the previous, now dying, institutions. Egypt was in a declining state, and out of nowhere, the evil Hyksos violently invaded Egypt, burning cities, enslaving the population, and conquering the north. They then waged war against the last bastion of Egyptian resistance at Thebes. However, the good Egyptians gained the upper hand and eventually freed Egypt from their tyranny. Just kidding. Many people believe that the Hyksos were violent invaders, and that they tried their best to destroy Egypt. This narrative is outdated. More likely, the Hyksos, with the other groups of peoples from the east, migrated to Egypt by the end of the 12th dynasty and gradually became stronger. They mixed in with the Egyptians, and they adopted and admired Egyptian culture. The Hyksos became a large and powerful class by the late 18th century BC. By 1650 BC, they took advantage of the weakened state that Egypt was in and formed their own dynasty. This dynasty, known as the 15th dynasty, dominated the north. The north was united under a foreign dynasty, and unlike what we used to think, they were good with pretty much chilling in the north. By this time, the 13th dynasty fell apart, and it was to be replaced in the south by 2 new dynasties. The Abydos dynasty appears to have been a local dynasty that, as the name suggests, was based in Abydos. However, it wasn't the top dog of Upper Egypt. That honor belonged to the 16th dynasty, who may or may not have been vassals to the Hyksos. If they weren't, then they were an independent kingdom ruling in Thebes. To the very south, in Nubia, we have the kingdom of Kerma. They all traded with each other, and it was generally peaceful. Pausing the narrative for a bit, I want to examine the age of the Hyksos. The Hyksos ruled in the city of Hatwaret, also known as Avaris, which was the same city the kings of the 14th dynasty ruled. In fact, the 14th dynasty and the rulers had some characteristics of the Hyksos, especially with their rulers being descended from the east. It does beg the question, was the 14th dynasty also made of Hyksos rulers? In truth, we can never know, but as the Hyksos and the Canaanites were a growing class at the time, it is certainly possible. The gods of the Hyksos were Eastern in origin, with one of their chief gods being Baal. As they became Egyptianized, the Hyksos saw Baal as the same as the Egyptian god Set. It's also possible that Avaris was in contact with the Minoan Greeks, but we don't know for sure, and it's plausible this first contact actually happened later. Militarily, the Hyksos used bronze tools and weapons. Their most famous military legacy was the use of the chariot, as well as the introduction of the horse. Because of the Hyksos, the Egyptians had now been introduced to these new weapons of war. During the New Kingdom, chariots would become the key of the army, and a symbol of late Bronze Age warfare. Although the Egyptians of the New Kingdom hated the Hyksos, without them, their military success in the following centuries would have been much harder to achieve. Anyways, by the early 16th century BC, the Hyksos seemed to have started to fight the 16th dynasty. Along the way, they took Abydos and ended the local dynasty there. They slowly gained city after city, until they were right on the doorstep of the capital, Thebes. If there was a battle for Thebes, then it was a victory for the Hyksos, since Thebes fell to the Hyksos king under King Kion. However, after the death of Kion, a new dynasty would replace the fallen 16th dynasty. This new dynasty was much more aggressive than the previous. They wanted the Hyksos out. They wanted them out of Thebes, out of Avaris, and out of Egypt. Around 1580 BC, the 17th dynasty rose up in Thebes. It's possible this was due to infighting in the 15th dynasty, or maybe Apepe, the new king of the Hyksos, had to move his military forces to the north. Either way, the 17th dynasty began their rule with Rahotep. He began to rebuild temples and buildings desecrated from the Hyksos invasion. The 17th dynasty was able to take Abydos, and thus the majority of Upper Egypt. But interestingly, Apepe and Thebes were at peace for almost 2 decades. It's possible this was because the early pharaohs of the 17th dynasty weren't dynastically related, and were comprised of different Theban families. And so, as families changed, so did the goals of the dynasty. The majority of these kings contained little information about them, and the political situation in Egypt continued to remain unchanged. Still, this peace was very beneficial for the young dynasty. They had time to rebuild temples, and thus build their legitimacy at the same time. They were also able to establish garrisons in towns like Abydos. They were picking officials that were more loyal to the king, and as a result, the administration had become stronger and centralized. Unlike the other southern dynasties that came before them, the 17th was gradually getting stronger. It seemed that everything required to make Egypt strong again was coming along. A new golden age was bound to start. But when everything was ready, another crisis followed. The Thebans had already drawn up plans for their invasion of the north, when, out of nowhere, a Kushite army approached from the south. It had ransacked the southern cities. They were ultimately defeated and forced back south, but the plans to deal with the Hyksos had been temporarily postponed. To make things even worse, Apepe seemed to be closer and closer to formalizing an alliance between the 15th dynasty and the Kushites. This would put the Thebans in between their enemies, and they would be annihilated from the two-front war. Eventually, a man named Second Nenri-Ta took over, and his family would remain for the rest of the 17th dynasty. Actually, his family would remain involved in Egyptian politics for over 200 years, but that's not important right now. Anyways, it's most likely that under Second Nenri, hostilities between the natives and the Hyksos resumed. In a somewhat, most likely fictional story, Apepe complains to Second Nenri that the hippos at Thebes had kept him awake all night, all the way to Avaris. In reality, Second Nenri was probably very nervous with the diplomacy of the day. If he couldn't knock the Hyksos out, it was only a matter of time until Thebes fell from a joint Hyksos-Kushite alliance. Looking at Second Nenri's mummified head, there was a pretty nasty wound, inflicted by an axe, probably of Hyksos origin. What probably happened was that Second Nenri declared war on the Hyksos, and after the Thebans met the Hyksos in battle, they got trashed on, and the king was killed. Gamos succeeded Second Nenri-Ta, and his starting situation was not great to say the least. The least of the problems was the inexperience of Kamos, not to mention the threat of Kushite invasion and a defeated and demoralized Egyptian state. What could Kamos possibly do to save Thebes from imminent danger? Despite the pleading from his advisors, Kamos refused to submit to Hyksos' vassalage, or peace for that matter. He decided to strike south against Kush. He pushed past the first cataract, and he met little resistance. He reached the old Buhin fortress, one of the greatest legacies from the Middle Kingdom. He appointed an Egyptian official to govern the region, and like that, the southern flank was protected from Kushite invasion. With the south now protected, Kamos shifted his attention north. He attacked the city of Nefruzi, and he looted the city. After attacking other cities in Middle Egypt, the Hyksos rule in the region collapsed, and victory was to go to Kamos. Kamos then discovered a 15th dynasty messenger, confirming the Theban fears that the Hyksos were indeed looking to form an alliance with the Kushites. But the fact that Apepe was desperate to ally with Kush to defeat Thebes tells us that the Hyksos were weak. As Toby Wilkinson says, Apepe had fatally betrayed his own weakness by requesting Kushite support. Kamos continued on, reaching the delta of the Nile. He was able to reach Avaris, but he wasn't able to initially take the city. Although he laid siege to the city, he was still unable to take it. Kamos, other than the setback at Avaris, had been victorious, and he returned home to Thebes. Then, Kamos died. He only reigned for about 5 years, but in those 5 years, he turned Thebes from a weak local dynasty, sandwiched between the 15th dynasty and the Kushite kingdom, into a powerful kingdom, with holdings in Nubia and on the verge of reunification. But, as quickly as all that came, that could all be lost if the wrong successor came to the throne. Following the death of Kamos, the 17th dynasty came to a close, and it was replaced by the 18th dynasty. Ahmose I succeeded Kamos as the ruler of Thebes, but he was only a boy. He wasn't old enough to rule, and as a result, the war entered into a stalemate. But, given that the Hyksos were licking their wounds, they could do nothing about Thebes. The Hyksos possibly recaptured Heliopolis, but nothing significant beyond that. All that any ruler could do in Egypt at that time was to wait. Around 1530 BC, Ahmose finally became of age, and the final assault against the Hyksos began. Ahmose sent the Theban navy to blockade Avaris and to prevent the Hyksos from amassing their forces. The war of attrition for Avaris was to now begin. The army would advance north until it reached Memphis. They eventually took the old capital. The Thebans had an even stronger claim for the control of Egypt. As I said, Avaris was put under siege, and it seemed to tilt to the Thebans' favor. One of the bravest soldiers during the siege, and the person who serves as their primary source, was Ahmose, son of Abana, not to be confused with Ahmose I. Ahmose, son of Abana, helped kill several soldiers while attacking past the citadel of Avaris. We will see more of Ahmose, son of Abana, as we go on. Meanwhile, Ahmose continued his campaigns along the delta. He took the town of Ayunu, and then captured the fort of Jaru. Avaris eventually fell to the Theban forces. The Thebans massacred the Hyksos that remained in their former capital. Those who escaped wouldn't have a better fate. The purpose of taking Jaru was that now, the Egyptian army had forces stationed along the frontier border. Ahmose, to finally deal with the Hyksos, once and for all, invaded the Sinai Peninsula and attacked the chief Hyksos city outside of Egypt. After a 3-year siege, the city fell. After nearly 200 years, Asiatic rule in Egypt had ended, and the new kingdom, the greatest age of Egyptian history, had begun. Ahmose wasted no time after reunifying Egypt. He turned south back to Nubia. Instead of just securing the border like his predecessors had done, Ahmose wanted the rich wealth from the Nubian gold mines. He brought his forces to the river island of Sha'at, and then built a fortress there. On his way back, some Nubians revolted, but Ahmose crushed them. In Nefruzi, another revolt started. Ahmose crushed this one as well. After he returned from Nubia, he campaigned in the Near East. It is said he reached the Euphrates River, but he probably didn't reach that far. That legacy would belong to his successors in the next video on the series. At home, Ahmose increased his royal legitimacy and put his family in powerful positions, especially in terms of religion. Ahmose's dynasty, the 18th, would become known for their attempts at increasing royal power through religion, as we will see during the Amarna period. By around 1525 BC, Ahmose, the unifier of Egypt, and the man who had driven out the Hyksos, was dead. His son, Amenhotep I, succeeded him, but like Ahmose, he became pharaoh at a premature age. Amenhotep protected Egypt's borders against the Libyans, and possibly traveled down to Nubia and campaigned there. Other than that, his reign was nothing but peace. He restored and built many temples along the Nile. Amenhotep is most remembered for his burial. He also decided to hide his personal tomb and built a mortuary temple so the subjects would worship him while keeping his grave safe from robbery. He was the first of many New Kingdom pharaohs to hide their tomb in the Valley of the Kings. To this day, his original tomb has never been discovered. While I usually end these videos at the beginning of a new dark age, this time we'll leave on a good note. Egypt was in peace and recovering from the previous 2 centuries. The power of the new kingdom was increasing. Egypt's military might was building. Everything was in place for a mighty empire, one stronger than the golden age of the old kingdom, one larger than the kingdom ruled by Senusret III. The stage was set for a superpower to rise in the Near East. The only thing that was left was for someone to push past the traditional borders of Egypt. Someone we will talk about in the next video of this series. Hey everyone, thanks for watching part 3 of Ancient Egypt. Next episode, we will discuss the rise of the Egyptian Empire and the age of Thutmose. If you'd like to support me, please subscribe to the channel, and to those who have already supported me, thank you. I can't wait to bring you the next part of this series, and I'm excited for what's ahead. Anyways, I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.